So, Michael, can you tell me a little bit more about Generation Y as you were describing yesterday?
Yeah, so they're a global generation. That's probably the first thing that really stands out that makes this group quite different. So between the ages typically of 11 and 29, so they're born between the early 80s and the late 1990s. And right around the world we've sort of got a generation who are so consistent because they are the first group to grow up in this sort of global village that we talk about, where everyone's connected. And so some of the characteristics that we see about Generation Y, on the positive side, we see them as a generation who are very flexible, they're very innovative, very creative in many cases. They are often very adept at challenging the way things are done and asking why and thinking of new ways to do things because they've been encouraged to do that. They're a self-esteem generation, so they've been raised being told how special and brilliant and magnificent and wonderful they are. And so there's some very positive things to do with the confidence of this group. But there are some challenging things too, and I'm certainly working with teachers. There's a few criticisms you hear about Gen Y that many of them are very valid. That Gen Y can be very impatient. They want everything now. And they've been raised in this convenience era where they're led to believe life is meant to be easy, and so they want things to happen quickly and easily and simply. They seem to be a generation who are often seen as disrespectful. They tend to want to have a connection with the relationship rather than the role of the person. So just because you're my teacher or my employer or my parent, that doesn't mean I'll give you respect. They're what we call a postmodern generation. So the idea of truth not being absolute but relative. So truth is based on my experience. So there's some of the really interesting characteristics we see. Of course, they're tech savvy. They're used to the internet.
Absolutely.
And those things are consistent right around the world.
All right, and in terms of the way that Generation Y learns, because I think this is one of the things obviously I'm interested in, I can see exactly what you're saying reflected in the learning environment in terms of how that impatience, for example, is translated into an unwillingness to accept received knowledge, received information that's driven from the top down. So in terms of the structures, how would you think that they're responding to things like learning, to traditional methods of teaching? Do you think that they're actually unwilling to fall into these sorts of models?
Well, to some extent they're responding to the culture of education they've grown up around, and part of that culture has been a movement away from the focus on memory, learning things by rote. And so it's a generation who've been raised in an era where teachers no longer sort of ask the students, what do you remember from last week's lesson? The question now is, well, what did you learn? And so there is a different emphasis in education, but so they've been shaped by the educational institutions they've gone through, but also they are shaping the educational institutions.
Absolutely.
They have access to so much more information, and so they're more empowered, I think, than previous groups.
They're certainly more empowered, and their relationship to what would have been considered the sort of inviolable knowledge of the teacher, for example, is being broken down.
Yes,
isn't it? It's
absolutely.
being broken down completely, as they draw in information from other sources. But one of the great problems with that, of course, is that these other sources are not necessarily reliable. So that there is a whole lot of work to be done around building up their critical skills, their analytical skills, in terms of the information they retrieve from the internet or from these other resources, wherever they come from. And how about the idea of participatory learning? This is something that's very much part of the way they want to behave, isn't it? The way they're demanding to behave. They want to create new knowledge. They want to participate in the learning process. They won't accept being just told what to do anymore.
And that comes back to the empowerment of this group. They've been told since they were born they have a voice, they have a brain, and they have rights, and so to use those three things. And we've got to remember, Gen Y are the children of the baby boomers. And the baby boomers raise their kids to have a great degree of confidence about their rights individually, and that flows over to the way they learn. And so they want to be involved in the learning process, not just be the empty vessels that are filled from the teacher. They want to be actively involved in the process of inquiry-based learning and finding things out for myself. So the teacher asking a question that allows the student to figure it out, rather than the teacher being the fountain of knowledge that gives all the answers. And so, with this group, we talk about that old adage, knowledge is power, and many of them have so much knowledge, or at least so much information. I mean, information and knowledge, of course, are different things. They've got access to so much information, so that perceived power, the power they think they have, or even the knowledge they think they have is quite different. So you often see a mismatch between confidence and actual intelligence.
Yes. Well, we were talking about this earlier on, that there is a great problem area in terms of this empowerment of that generation and their actual ability to respond to holding that power. That is, they don't necessarily have the tools to exercise the power that they've got, been given, or demand having. They don't have those critical skills, those analytical skills, those creative skills. Because now, of course, a lot of it is about generating content, isn't it? Generating, contributing to a bank of knowledge, contributing to YouTube, to Facebook, to Wikipedia, but about subject areas, about content-driven areas. And they don't necessarily have the tools to be able to do that in a way that's meaningful or sustainable. So this is a problem area, but at the same time it's incredibly exciting to give them that opportunity.
Well, it's exciting because you've got a generation who are being encouraged to not just receive but to create. And you know, we talk about being in this modern age of, you know, the information age, and we were speaking the other day about in the information age, thought is the currency, and so the ability to think, the ability to put together original ideas, or re-put together old ideas in a new way or in a new light, or using new technology, is really quite critical. The challenge is, we do have a generation who see their own version of truth as the most important in the world. Everyone else is equally important, but it does mean that there's no absolute rule, this one line that you can measure yourself against, and that is
I like that
incredibly
idea.
problematic.
It is. It's problematic, and it's something that where we have to find this delicate area between addressing the problem in terms of finding ways to develop responses within them, within that generation, to perhaps moving away from that extreme relativity to places where they have confidence in belief systems that they essentially construct for themselves. So as educationalists, or as teachers, or as people constructing systems for holding learning together, the trick is not to just impose a type of system on them, because they'll reject it immediately. I mean, part of this generation's thing is that they will not be imposed upon. So we have to find subtle ways to engender these essential qualities of response, which is what it is, isn't it? Critical response, analytical response, etc. So when we're developing any type of learning system, we're going to have to build this into it.
And it needs to be flexible. It'll need to change.
It needs to be flexible.
It does.
Well, this is another thing about future-proofing, because we mentioned earlier on that Generation Y is all very fine, but we're talking about a generation that has another one on its shoulders.
That's correct.
There's another one coming up that's going to be different, even more perhaps, even more empowered in the sense of being connected to technology in a way that we find inconceivable perhaps at the moment, and breathing it and thinking it without, as we drive cars perhaps, without any second thought. So we have to think about our responses to technology, but that generation in particular, the next one coming along, won't even think about it. It'll just be part of their skin.
Well, it's an interesting way of putting it. I often look at the difference between Generation Y and Generation Z, what's coming after them, is Gen Y still have moments where they're impressed by technology.
Yes, that's right.
They're still amazed that you can Skype your friend in Germany and it's free. Gen Z are not impressed.
No,
only because they've never known a world without it. And so they will have a set of expectations, not driven by hubris or arrogance or the sense of I deserve the best, but they just don't know what it's like not to have those things.
That's right.
And so they will just have a base level expectation that's going to mean it's going to be difficult to engage them, particularly in the classroom.
Exactly. So what we're talking about specifically in terms of the awards requirements to engage this particular generation, and perhaps to look forward to the generations that are coming afterward, what would you think are the main issues that need to be addressed, or the main ways that they could go about engaging with that group?
Well, the critical thing, and this is the case in many organisations, there's certainly those who are engaging users, in marketing to people who are going to be involved in the product, is to make it easy, to make it simple to be involved.
Well, that as well, of course. I mean, if we're talking about communicating, that's absolutely essential. But if we're talking about development of any systematic response, we're talking about an online environment, it's exactly the same thing. You have to translate that ease, that facility, both technically and in terms of the communicative process.
And so it's coming back to what's the purpose of it? What's the outcome we want to go toward? And then realise that how do we make the process to get there as simple as possible? Because the process is useful and it's necessary, but the outcome is more important.
Absolutely.
And so whether that's a case of allowing the process of being accountable or record keeping, the online record book is an example of that, making the process simpler so that you can attract more people. Now this is not lowering the bar to make it easier, but just realising that actually the process of achieving the award, while it has value, it's not the outcome, it's not the point. And so making that as easy as possible I think is really key, particularly for this generation who are, for better or worse, used to convenience and expect convenience. And so I suppose making it as easy as possible, making the entry level as easy as possible is probably a really critical part. And I think also creating a sense of community. This group loves community.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm absolutely behind you there, because one of the approaches that we're taking for the development of the online training is that the community, the development of that social community, and the development of that community that contributes to the knowledge bank is essential, because without it, this particular generation, and I'm absolutely sure the ones that follow it, will reject any type of learning, because that's absolutely what's central to their vision.